The room was heavy with silence. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes the ticking of a clock sound like a thunderclap. Reporters shifted in their seats. Cameras snapped nervously. And every eye turned toward the raised bench where Judge Amul Thapar adjusted his robe with the calm assurance of a man used to commanding attention. He leaned forward, his voice slicing through the quiet like a blade. Representative Crockett. He began, his tone clipped. Do you honestly believe your position holds any legal ground? Or are we simply indulging in theatrics today? Gasps rippled through the chamber. It wasn't just a question. It was an accusation, wrapped in polished arrogance. Thapar's words carried weight not because they were fair, but because they were delivered with the calculated precision of a man who believed he had the power to corner anyone who dared stand in his path. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her eyes locked on his, steady, unflinching. And for a heartbeat, the room seemed to forget to breathe. The cameras zoomed in, desperate to capture the tremor, the falter, the stumble that Judge Thapar clearly expected. But it never came. Instead, the stillness thickened. You could feel the tension knotting in the air, the smug certainty radiating from the bench, the quiet anticipation in the gallery, the hushed whispers of aides wondering if this was the moment Crockett would be undone. But Jasmine Crockett was not the kind to wither under pressure. Her presence filled the space differently, not with loudness, not with showmanship, but with the quiet strength of someone who knew the fight was bigger than herself. She represented more than her own voice. She carried with her the weight of every underestimated woman, every silenced community, every immigrant child who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Judge Thapar's jab was meant to shrink her, to reduce her into a caricature for his authority to dismiss. But in that instant, as the cameras captured the fire in her eyes, something shifted. And in that instant, nobody could have predicted the firestorm about to erupt, because Jasmine Crockett was not about to be silenced. The exchange between Judge Amul Thapar and Jasmine Crockett was more than a courtroom sparring match. It was the collision of two Americas, staring each other down under fluorescent lights and marble columns. On one side, the bench symbolized the weight of authority, the voice of the establishment, the old guard that had long dictated who was worthy of being heard. On the other stood a woman whose very presence defied the expectations of that tradition, young, unapologetic, and unwilling to bow. For years, America has been at war with itself over dignity and power. Who holds the mic, and who gets muted? Whose stories are amplified, and whose truths are brushed aside as noise? The moment Thapar fired his jab, the room was no longer just a courtroom. Crockett's calm composure wasn't just personal courage. It was symbolic resistance. In that quiet defiance, she spoke for millions, for the young woman watching from her dorm room who had been talked over in class, for the immigrant worker who had been ignored in policy debates, for the parent who had been told their dreams were unrealistic. The stakes weren't only political. They were generational. Thapar's role reflected the guardrails of the past, the slow, deliberate, often suffocating pace of power. Crockett embodied the urgency of the present, a generation unwilling to wait. Another decade for justice, for equity, for recognition. Their clash was a mirror of the American divide, one side clinging to control, the other demanding space at the table. The cultural symbolism was unavoidable. Thapar's words landed with the weight of establishment arrogance. A man cloaked in robes of authority. Crockett's silence in response wasn't weakness, it was strategy. The prelude to a counterstrike that would expose the cracks in that very authority. Every heartbeat of the moment told those in the room this was no ordinary hearing. And while the audience within those walls held its breath, the wider world had yet to catch fire. Cameras captured the stillness, and feeds were already beginning to circulate, waiting for the next line, the next spark. Millions would soon watch, but those in the room already felt history turning. Because this wasn't about whether one politician or one judge would score a point. It was about whether dignity could stand tall against the machinery of arrogance, whether a voice of truth could rise above the noise of intimidation. And in that fragile, electric pause between question and answer, one thing became clear. The judge had no idea what was about to hit him. To understand why the moment with Jasmine Crockett mattered so much, you have to know who Judge Amul Thapar is, and more importantly, the way he has wielded his power. Thapar rose through the ranks with the polish of a man groomed for authority. Born to immigrant parents, he often spoke of hard work and opportunity, yet in practice, his decisions leaned toward preserving the very hierarchies that shut doors on others. His ascent was fueled by conservative patrons who saw in him not just a judge, but a weapon, someone who could wrap the steel of ideology in the velvet of judicial rhetoric. And Thapar knew it. He relished the role. In every courtroom he entered, he carried himself with the posture of a man convinced of his own brilliance. Lawyers whispered about his clipped tone, his impatience with arguments that didn't align with his worldview. To supporters, he was sharp, unyielding, a legal mind not afraid to speak his truth. To critics, he was arrogance in human form, a man so intoxicated by his own authority that he mistook bullying for brilliance. There were moments that revealed the contradictions. He liked to remind audiences of his immigrant roots, yet he sided with rulings that made life harder for immigrant families seeking justice. He extolled fairness from the bench, yet his questioning often dripped with condescension when aimed at women, younger attorneys, or progressive advocates. It was the tone of a man convinced that deference was his due, that the courtroom was his theatre, and he its undisputed star. One infamous exchange years earlier painted the picture perfectly. A civil rights attorney had stood before him, arguing a case on voting access. Thapar interrupted halfway through, smirking as he asked, "Are you here to argue law, or to give us your feelings?" The gallery had gasped then too, but nothing had followed. The attorney stumbled, the momentum broke, and Thapar leaned back with the satisfied air of a man who had demonstrated control. There was another case, a union dispute where workers sought protection after a corporation cut corners on safety. Thapar listened, nodding politely, then delivered a line dripping with contempt. Perhaps the solution isn't more regulation, but for people to find better employers. The corporate representatives chuckled. The workers left the courtroom in silence, defeated. For Thapar, it was another victory, another reminder that his words could shrink an opponent to nothing. That was his pattern, confidence sharpened into cruelty, contradictions hidden beneath the robe of authority. He presented himself as the product of the American dream, but when confronted with others trying to climb the same ladder, he pulled it up behind him. And it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. His pauses lingered just long enough to sting. His questions were framed less to uncover truth than to trap. His smile, thin and calculated, gave off the impression of a man who relished the discomfort of those who dared to oppose him. He played the part of impartial judge, but his stagecraft betrayed him. Behind the polished rhetoric was a man who believed he could bend others to his will, that his robe insulated him from consequences. He had cowed seasoned attorneys, rattled witnesses, and left rising leaders second-guessing themselves. And every time he walked away, more convinced that no one could match his intellectual might. That was the man who sat across from Jasmine Crockett, a man accustomed to winning exchanges before they even began, a man whose arrogance was not a secret flaw but the very centerpiece of his performance. And so when he leaned forward that day, voice edged with disdain, he believed he was watching history repeat itself. Another rising figure, another opportunity to show his dominance. To him, it was routine. But what Judge Thapar could not see, what everyone else in that room would soon realize, was that this time, the script was about to flip, and that arrogance would soon face a reckoning. Yet beneath the fire, there was calm. Crockett never mistook outrage for effectiveness. Her strategy was always to remain composed, to let her opponents overextend themselves, while she waited for the right moment to strike. She had mastered the art of patience, of silence that carried more weight than noise. It was that combination, the sharp wit and the unshakable composure, that made her dangerous to anyone who underestimated her. Which is why the clash with Judge Thapar mattered. He saw only another ambitious young figure to put in their place. What he failed to see was the years of training, the battles fought long before she stepped into his courtroom. He failed to see the resilience forged in the trenches of public defense, the empathy carved into her by the countless stories she had carried. He failed to see that Crockett was not walking into this moment unarmed. She was bringing an entire lifetime of struggle, dignity, and conviction with her. She had faced men like him before, men with power, with arrogance, with the assumption that intimidation would do the work of argument. And every time, she learned not just how to endure, but how to flip the script. She learned that the louder her opponent grew, the steadier she needed to become. That the sharper the insult, the calmer the comeback. That true strength was not in bluster, but in balance. On that day, in that hushed courtroom, Jasmine Crockett was not just a representative or an attorney. She was the embodiment of every person who had been told to sit down, to stay quiet, to defer to authority even when authority was wrong. She carried not just her own voice, but the voices of those who had trusted her to fight when they could not. And so, when Judge Thapar leaned forward with his condescension sharpened like a blade, Crockett did not flinch. She did not stumble. She did not shrink. Because Jasmine Crockett was ready. She had always been ready. And her response would ignite more than the courtroom. It would ignite the nation. The courtroom air grew tighter with each word. Cameras clicked in quick succession, capturing every flicker of expression. Judge Thapar leaned forward, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "Representative Crockett," he began, dragging her title like an anchor. "Are you here to present facts, or just to give us another performance?" The jab was sharp, designed to cut her credibility before she could even respond. A ripple moved through the gallery, a few gasps, a murmur. The collective inhale of an audience sensing a fight. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes fixed on him, calm and unwavering. She let the silence stretch, refusing to be rushed, refusing to play into his tempo. That composure, that steady, unblinking gaze, was more unnerving than any outburst could have been. Thapar smirked, misreading her calm as weakness. He pressed harder. "This chamber is not a stage, representative. We are here for reason, not rhetoric. Unless, of course, you think slogans carry more weight than substance." His tone rose, sharp enough to cut through the murmurs in the room. His confidence was on full display. The certainty that he could needle her into stumbling. Each word was meant not just for Crockett, but for the audience, the cameras, the record. But Jasmine remained still, hands folded, posture steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured. "Judge Thapar, I came with facts. If you mistake truth for theatre, perhaps it says more about the script you're used to reading." The words landed softly, but the meaning struck hard. A subtle shift passed through the room, murmurs growing into quiet chuckles, nods of approval flickering like sparks. Thapar's smile tightened. His voice grew louder. "So you believe this is truth? That your arguments outweigh the centuries of precedent that brought us here? Tell me, representative, where exactly did you study law that taught you defiance as doctrine?" The attack was personal now, calibrated to belittle, to remind her of hierarchy. He expected her to bristle, to break. Instead, Crockett tilted her head slightly, almost amused. "My law," she replied calmly, "was written in the lives of the people I serve. Precedent means nothing if it silences justice." The audience stirred again. A low hum of agreement coursed through the gallery. Thapar shifted in his chair, his volume climbing another notch. He pounded the words like a gavel. "Justice, representative, is not what you feel. It is what is written. And unless you can point to the line, the statute, the precedent, then you have nothing here but noise." Now the air was electric. The villain was louder, angrier, pressing with every ounce of authority in his voice. But across from him, Jasmine Crockett remained unshaken. Her calm was a fortress. Her silence between his questions was deafening, forcing the judge's voice to fill the void, to echo louder, harsher, more desperate. And then, at last, she leaned forward, her voice still steady, sharp as a blade hidden in velvet. "If you believe justice is only what is written, then perhaps you've forgotten who holds the pen." The room froze. Murmurs swelled into gasps. Thapar's face flickered with the faintest flash of recognition, the sense that control was slipping from his grasp. He tried again, louder now, almost shouting. "Are you suggesting, representative, that you rewrite the law with sentiment? That you defy the very foundation this nation was built upon?" Crockett did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her composure was unshakable, her gaze locked, her words precise. Each response struck with surgical precision, turning his questions back on him. revealing the arrogance at their core. Tension thickened, a live wire strung across the courtroom. The gallery leaned in, breathless, sensing the clash was reaching a breaking point. The villain's voice thundered, the hero's silence cut sharper still. Every second stretched longer, heavier. And then, the silence broke with a line nobody will ever forget. For a moment, silence hung in the air like a taut string. Every eye fixed on Jasmine Crockett. Judge Thapar had delivered his barrage, his voice rising. His gavel-like words meant to hammer her into submission. But now, all the room could hear was the faint buzz of cameras, the scribble of a journalist's pen, and the pounding heartbeat of anticipation. Crockett inhaled slowly, her hands still folded, her posture unbroken. Then, with the calm of someone who had been here before, on the receiving end of condescension, on the front lines of arrogance, she began. "Judge Thapar," she said evenly, "you ask where I learned the law? I learned it in the cases of young men wrongfully accused, whose names were erased by systems that never saw them as innocent until proven guilty. I learned it in the families evicted from their homes, because corporations had more rights than the people living inside. I learned it in classrooms where children asked why their parents couldn't vote, and I had no answer but injustice." And her truth became unshakable. This was more than a viral clip. It was a reminder of what America claims to stand for, that dignity cannot be dictated, that justice is not the privilege of the loudest or the most powerful, but the right of every person willing to stand up and speak. Crockett's words carried beyond the courtroom, because they touched something universal, the belief that silence in the face of intimidation is not strength, but surrender. And she chose not to surrender. In that moment, she was not just Representative Jasmine Crockett. She was the voice of every immigrant child told to wait their turn, every worker told they were replaceable, every woman whose intelligence was dismissed with a smirk. She was proof that resilience lives in refusing to bend when bending seems easier. America thrives not when authority goes unquestioned, but when voices rise against arrogance. Its history is written by those who challenged the norms, who asked why injustice was considered lawful, who demanded better even when told to sit down. Crockett joined that lineage with one steady gaze, one unshaken tone, one unforgettable line that echoed far beyond the courtroom. And the moral was clear. Intimidation is fragile. Arrogance is brittle. Power without principle is destined to crack. What lasts, what always lasts, is courage. Her response was not just for that day, or that judge, or that courtroom. It was a symbol for anyone who has ever been cornered, underestimated, or dismissed. It was proof that the smallest voice, if spoken with conviction, can topple the loudest roar. Because in the end, courage always outshines power. And so, the story comes full circle. Judge Amul Thapar tried to corner Jasmine Crockett, but instead, she shut him down instantly. What he intended as a moment of dominance became the stage for her defining act of resilience. His arrogance crumbled under the weight of her composure, and her words echoed far beyond the courtroom, reminding the nation that truth, spoken fearlessly, can silence even the loudest attempts at intimidation. This was never just about one exchange. It was about what it represents, the eternal struggle between dignity and arrogance, between truth and distortion, between the voices that demand justice and the forces that try to smother them. In that courtroom, we witnessed more than debate. We witnessed proof that courage, when rooted in conviction, is unstoppable. Jasmine Crockett showed us that America's promise does not live in precedent alone, nor in titles or robes, but in the voices of those willing to stand tall, when everything around them demands they shrink. Her defiance was not chaos. It was clarity. Her rebuttal was not noise. It was necessity. And her strength was not just her own. It belonged to everyone who refuses to be silenced. If you believe in truth over arrogance, in justice over intimidation, then you are in the right place. This is the American brief, where power is challenged, drama unfolds, and voices like Crockett's remind us why these stories matter. Subscribe now, because the next showdown is coming, and you won't want to miss it.